Your account shows a balance of $847, the banker said, sliding the statement across the desk toward me. I stared at the paper. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. My hands went rigid around the edge of the document. I'd been depositing my teacher's pension for 8 years. 8 years of careful saving. The account should have held nearly $180,000. Instead, it held less than $1,000. There must be a mistake, I heard myself say. The words felt distant, like someone else was speaking them. The banker, a young woman named Eliea with sympathetic eyes, shook her head slowly. I've pulled your full transaction history. The withdrawals are all authorized, all using your PIN. My PIN, the 4 numbers I'd written down, the 4 numbers I'd given to my son Grigian 3 years ago when he'd asked to help me with my finances. Just to help manage things, he'd said. Just to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of by scammers. Just so someone younger could keep track of everything while I focused on my teaching job. I'd trusted him completely. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I reached for the armrest of the chair and held on. Eliea was still talking, explaining something about the withdrawals, but the words were becoming a blur. 50 withdrawals over 36 months, every single one between $3,000 and $5,000. Every single one moving money out of my account into another account I didn't recognize. When did these start? I managed to ask. Eliea pulled up her computer screen and turned it toward me. The first withdrawal was 3 years and 2 months ago, the day after you opened this account. 3 years and 2 months. That was exactly when Grigian had asked for my PIN. That was exactly when my youngest son had decided to take control of my finances to protect me from fraud. I sat there in that bank chair, staring at numbers that didn't make sense. Numbers that represented my retirement. Numbers that represented my security. Numbers that represented my son's betrayal, laid out in perfect black and white on a computer screen. Everything I'd built for 30 years meant nothing now. Eliea was asking if I wanted to file a report. I nodded, but I wasn't really hearing her. My mind was already moving backward through time, cataloging every conversation with Grigian, every time he'd asked about my finances, every time he'd offered to help. I was seeing our entire relationship through a new lens now, and nothing looked the same. The banker printed out the full transaction history. 47 pages. Each page filled with my betrayal, documented in meticulous detail by the very institution that was supposed to protect my money. I took the papers from Eliea's hands and stood up on legs that didn't feel entirely solid. I need to go home, I said. Of course, Eliea replied gently. And Miss Coleman, you should consider filing a police report as well. This is theft, regardless of the PIN. Theft. My son had stolen from me. The words didn't fit together in any way that made sense. I drove home on autopilot, the transaction history sitting on my passenger seat like an accusation. My hands kept moving to the steering wheel and back to my lap as if I couldn't find a position that felt right. The afternoon sun was bright, almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Everything outside my car looked normal. The world looked exactly as it had that morning when I'd woken up thinking I was a woman with a secure retirement and a son I could trust. Now I was something else entirely. I was a victim. I was a fool. I was a mother whose own child had stolen from her systematically for 3 years. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for 10 minutes without moving. My house looked exactly as it always did. The rose bushes I'd planted 5 years ago were in full bloom. The porch I'd had painted last spring was still a clean white. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything was exactly where it had been when I'd left this morning. Everything had changed completely. I finally got out of the car and walked inside. The house was quiet. I lived alone now, had for 7 years since my divorce from Gretchen's father. It was just me in this house, just me and my pension, just me and my carefully managed life. Except my pension was gone, and my carefully managed life had been managed by someone else entirely. I set the transaction history on my kitchen table and made coffee. My hands moved through the familiar motions automatically. Coffee, mug, cream, sugar. The routine was comforting even as everything else was falling apart. I sat at the table with the 47 pages spread out in front of me and began to read through them carefully, line by line. The first withdrawal had been $3,200, then $4,100, then $3,800. The amounts varied just enough that they might not trigger immediate attention. The dates were spaced out. Never 2 withdrawals in the same week. Never on obvious days like the 1st or the 15th. Whoever had set this up had planned it carefully. Whoever had set this up had wanted it to work for as long as possible without being discovered. Whoever had set this up was my son. I picked up my phone and called Gretchen. It rang 4 times before he answered. His voice was bright, casual, the voice of a man who had no idea his mother was sitting at her kitchen table staring at evidence of his theft. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" I couldn't speak at first. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. I was trying to reconcile the cheerful voice on the phone with the person who had stolen $178,000 from me over 3 years. "Mom, you there?" "I went to the bank today," I said finally. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin, fragile. There was a pause. Not long, just a beat. But in that pause, I heard everything I needed to know. He knew. He'd known all along, and now he knew that I knew. "Yeah? Everything okay?" The lie was so smooth, so practiced. It made me wonder how many lies he'd told me over the years. How many conversations had been built on deception? How many times had he looked me in the eye and smiled while stealing from me? "My account is nearly empty, Gretchen. 47 withdrawals over 3 years, all using my PIN. The PIN I gave you." Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear him thinking, calculating, trying to figure out what to say. "Mom, I can explain." I hung up. My hands were shaking now, and I set the phone down carefully on the table. I didn't want to hear his explanation. I didn't want to hear him try to justify what he'd done. I didn't want to hear him spin some story about needing the money or having a good reason or any of the 1,000 excuses that thieves tell themselves. I wanted to understand how my own son had looked me in the eye for 3 years and stolen from me. The phone rang again. Gretchen. I didn't answer. It rang 6 more times over the next hour. Each time, I watched the screen light up with his name and did nothing. Finally, he stopped calling. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the ringing had been. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through my mail. Old mail. Mail from the past 3 years. I'd been careless about it, throwing away envelopes without always opening them, trusting that if something important had happened, someone would tell me. But as I opened envelope after envelope, I began to see a pattern I'd missed entirely. Bank statements. I had boxes of old bank statements in my closet, and I pulled them all out and spread them across my living room floor. I organized them by date and began to read through them systematically. The withdrawals were there in every single one. Documented, recorded. Proof of theft written in the language of finance. But something else was there too. Something I should have noticed years ago if I'd been paying attention. Mail from the bank had started arriving at a different address. My mail was being forwarded. Not all of it, just the bank statements, just the financial records, just the evidence of what was happening to my money. I found the forwarding order in a file box under my desk. It was dated 3 years and 2 months ago. The handwriting on the form wasn't mine. It was Gregian's. He'd filled out the forwarding form, forged my signature, and had all my bank mail sent to a P.O. box he'd rented under a fake name. My son hadn't just stolen from me. My son had intercepted my mail. My son had systematically hidden the evidence of his theft from me for 3 years. I sat on my living room floor surrounded by 47 pages of transaction history and 3 years of bank statements, and I felt something break inside me. Not dramatically, not with tears or anger or any of the emotions I might have expected. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of trust shattering. It was the sound of a relationship ending. It was the sound of a mother realizing her son was a stranger. The phone rang again. This time it was my daughter, Tiaili. She lived 2 hours away and rarely called during the week. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mom? Hi, I'm calling because Gregian just called me. He's really upset. He says you think he stole from you? That doesn't even make sense. He's been helping you manage your money. I closed my eyes. Of course he'd called her. Of course he was already trying to control the narrative. Of course he was calling his sister to convince her that his mother was being unreasonable. He stole $178,000 from me, Tiaili. Over 3 years, using my PIN, and he intercepted my mail so I wouldn't see the bank statements. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. That's not possible, Tiaili said finally. Gregian wouldn't do that. He's been so helpful to you. He's always been there for you. He's been stealing from me, I said quietly. And he's been hiding it. The bank has all the records. The withdrawals are documented. The mail forwarding is documented. It's all there. Maybe there's a misunderstanding, Tiaili said, but her voice had changed. There was doubt in it now. Uncertainty, the first crack in Gregian's carefully constructed facade. There's no misunderstanding. I have the proof. I'm going to file a police report. Tiaili made a sound like she'd been struck. You're going to report your own son to the police? My own son stole from me, I said. My own son committed fraud. My own son broke the law. Yes, I'm going to report him. I hung up before she could respond. I knew what would happen next. Gregian would call more people. He would tell them his version of events. He would try to make himself the victim. He would try to make me seem like a confused old woman who didn't understand her own finances. He would do everything he could to discredit me before I had a chance to go to the authorities. But I had the proof. I had the documents. I had the transaction history and the mail forwarding form and 3 years of bank statements. I had everything I needed to prove that my son was a thief. I called the police that evening and made a report. The officer who took my statement was professional and kind. She asked detailed questions. She took down all the information about the withdrawals and the mail forwarding. She explained that this would be considered wire fraud and mail fraud, both federal crimes. She told me that she would be filing a report and that I should expect to be contacted by a detective within a few days. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen in the dark and tried to understand how I'd gotten here, how I'd raised a son who would steal from me, how I'd failed so completely as a mother that my own child felt entitled to take what wasn't his, how I'd been so blind for so long. The next morning, I called my bank and changed my PIN. I closed the account that had been compromised and opened a new one at a different bank. I placed a fraud alert on my credit report. I contacted the post office and canceled the mail forwarding order. I took every step I could think of to protect myself from my own son. Then I called my lawyer. Gregian tried to call me 17 times over the next 2 days. I didn't answer any of them. He left voicemails, angry voicemails, defensive voicemails, pleading voicemails. In each one, he tried a different approach. In one, he said he'd needed the money for a medical emergency. In another, he said he'd been planning to pay it back. In a third, he accused me of being ungrateful for all he'd done for me. None of it mattered. None of it changed what he'd done. A detective named Nick and Wright called me on the third day. She was thorough and professional. She asked me to bring in all my documentation. She explained that they would be seeking a warrant to search Gregion's home and his financial records. She told me that based on the evidence I'd provided, they had a strong case for prosecution. I spent that afternoon gathering everything: the transaction history, the bank statements, the mail forwarding form, the new account statements showing where my money had gone. Everything that proved my son was a thief. I put it all in a folder and drove to the police station. Detective Wright was a woman in her 50s, with gray streaking through her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. She listened to my story without interrupting. She examined each document carefully. She took notes. When I finished, she looked at me with something that might have been pity. "This is a clear case of fraud," she said. "The mail forwarding is particularly damaging to his defense. It shows intent to conceal. We'll be moving forward with charges." I nodded, but I didn't feel any satisfaction. I felt hollow. I felt like something essential had been removed from inside me and replaced with emptiness. Gregion was arrested 5 days later. I found out through Tiali, who called me in tears. She told me that police had shown up at his house with a warrant. They'd taken his computer and his financial records. They'd arrested him and taken him to the police station for questioning. I listened to my daughter cry on the phone and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no joy. Just the same hollow emptiness that had been there since I'd first seen that bank statement. The case moved quickly after that. Gregion was charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, and identity theft. The prosecutor's office contacted me and asked if I wanted to testify at trial. I said yes, but only because I wanted to make sure the evidence was presented clearly. I wanted to make sure there was no chance he could manipulate the system the way he'd manipulated me. In the weeks before the trial, I began to notice something strange. The life I'd built for myself was becoming smaller. I stopped going to the grocery store at the same time because I didn't want to run into people I knew. I stopped attending my book club because I didn't want to answer questions about my son. I stopped going to church because I couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes. My son had stolen $178,000 from me, and in doing so, he'd stolen my sense of safety. He'd stolen my trust. He'd stolen my ability to move through the world without feeling ashamed. Tiali stopped calling. She'd chosen to believe her brother's version of events, or at least to pretend she did. She'd decided that being loyal to him meant abandoning me. She'd decided that my betrayal was worse than his betrayal, which was its own kind of betrayal. My other son, Leoer, called once. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him no. I told him to stay out of it. I told him to maintain his relationship with Gregion if he wanted to, but not to expect me to understand. He didn't call again. The trial was scheduled for 3 months after Gregion's arrest. 3 months of waiting, 3 months of living in a state of suspended animation, 3 months of trying to understand how to move forward when the person I'd been before was gone forever. I spent those months trying to rebuild my sense of self. I went to therapy. I talked to a counselor about betrayal and trust and how to move forward when the people you love hurt you. The counselor told me that what I was experiencing was normal. That betrayal by family was one of the deepest wounds a person could experience. That healing would take time. I wasn't sure I wanted to heal. Healing meant accepting what had happened, Healing meant moving forward with a son who was a thief. Healing meant rebuilding trust when I'd learned that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. The week before the trial, I received a letter from Gregian. His lawyer had sent it. In it, he offered to return half of the money he'd stolen in exchange for me dropping the charges. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he'd been under financial pressure. He said he was sorry. I read the letter 3 times, then I threw it away. He wasn't sorry. He was sorry he'd been caught. There was a difference, a big difference, and I wasn't going to let him buy his way out of consequences with promises of partial repayment. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in October. The courthouse was cold and formal. I sat in the witness stand and looked at my son across the courtroom. He looked smaller than I remembered. Diminished. He was wearing a suit his lawyer had probably chosen for him, and he was trying to look remorseful. But all I could see was the person who'd stolen from me. The prosecutor asked me to walk through the evidence. I did. I explained how I'd discovered the theft. I explained the mail forwarding. I explained the pattern of withdrawals. I answered every question clearly and directly. When it was the defense attorney's turn to cross-examine me, he tried to suggest that I'd been confused about my finances. He tried to suggest that maybe I'd authorized the withdrawals and forgotten. He tried to suggest that I was an elderly woman who didn't understand technology. I looked him directly in the eye and corrected him on every point. I was 58 years old, not elderly. I was a teacher, not confused. I understood my own finances perfectly well. And I understood that his client was a thief. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. Gregian was convicted of wire fraud, mail fraud, and identity theft. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. He would be eligible for parole in 3 years and 4 months. I sat in the courtroom and listened to the sentence and felt absolutely nothing. No triumph, no closure, no sense that justice had been served. Just the confirmation that my son was a criminal and that he would spend years in prison for what he'd done to me. After the trial, I drove home and sat in my kitchen in the dark. I thought about all the years I'd spent raising Gregian, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the times I'd put his needs before my own, all the love I'd given him. And I thought about how he'd repaid that love by stealing from me. I thought about the person I'd been before I'd discovered his theft. That person had felt safe in the world. That person had trusted her son. That person had believed that family meant something. That person was gone now, and I wasn't sure she was coming back. But I also thought about something else. I thought about the fact that I'd survived this. I'd discovered the theft. I'd reported it. I'd gone through the trial. I'd testified against my own son. I'd done what was necessary to protect myself and to hold him accountable. That took strength. That took courage. That took a kind of resilience I didn't know I had. The months after the trial were strange. I had to rebuild my life with the knowledge that one of my children was in prison and the other had chosen to believe his lies. I had to figure out how to move forward when the family I'd thought I had was fractured beyond repair. I started small. I went back to the grocery store at my regular time. I went back to my book club. I went back to church. I held my head up and I answered people's questions honestly. I didn't hide what had happened. I didn't pretend it hadn't occurred. I acknowledged it and I moved through it. I also had to figure out how to rebuild my finances. The money Gregian had stolen was gone. The courts could order him to make restitution, but that would take years, and there was no guarantee I'd ever see it. I had to accept that $178,000 of my retirement savings was simply gone. I picked up extra shifts at school. I took on summer teaching positions. I cut my expenses and lived more carefully. I rebuilt my savings, dollar by dollar, penny by penny. It would take years to get back to where I'd been, but I was determined to do it. A year after the trial, Tiali called me. She was crying. She said she'd been thinking about everything that had happened, and she'd realized that she'd chosen the wrong side. She said she'd talked to Grigian in prison, and he'd finally admitted that he'd stolen from me. She said she was sorry for not believing me. I listened to her apology, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of the possibility of forgiveness. Maybe the beginning of the possibility that I could have a relationship with my daughter again, even if my relationship with my son was permanently broken. I appreciate that, I said to Tiali. But I need time. I need to know that you understand what happened here. That you understand that your brother committed a serious crime against me. I do, Tiali said. I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have believed you. We talked for an hour that day. We didn't solve everything. We didn't fix the damage that had been done. But we took a first step toward rebuilding something. That was enough for now. 2 years after Grigian's arrest, I received a letter from him. He was in a federal penitentiary upstate, and he'd written to me asking for forgiveness. He said he'd spent the time in prison thinking about what he'd done. He said he understood now how much he'd hurt me. He said he was sorry, and that he hoped someday I could forgive him. I read the letter once, and then I put it away. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to forgive him. Maybe I never would be, but I also wasn't as angry anymore. The anger had faded over time, replaced by something more complicated. Sadness, disappointment, the grief of losing a son to his own choices. I kept the letter, though. I didn't throw it away. Maybe someday I'd be ready to respond. Maybe someday I'd be able to have a relationship with my son again. But not yet. Right now, I needed to focus on healing. I needed to focus on rebuilding my life. I needed to focus on being a better version of myself than I'd been before. 3 years after the trial, I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was Detective Wright. She told me that Grigian had been denied parole. He would serve at least another 1.5 years before he'd be eligible again. She was calling to give me a courtesy update because I'd been the victim in the case. I thanked her for calling. I hung up and I sat with the news. Grigian would be in prison for at least another 1.5 years. That meant more time for me to heal, more time for me to rebuild my life, more time for me to figure out who I was going to be moving forward. I looked around my kitchen. It was the same kitchen where I'd sat and discovered my son's theft. It was the same kitchen where I'd made the decision to report him. It was the same kitchen where I'd rebuilt my life, dollar by dollar, day by day. I'd survived this. I'd survived my son's betrayal. I'd survived the trial. I'd survived the aftermath. I'd survived the loss of money and trust and family. And I was still here. I was still standing. I was still moving forward. That was something. That was everything. The years that followed were about learning to live with what had happened. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo Grigian's theft. I couldn't restore the money he'd taken or the trust he'd broken. But I could choose how I moved forward. I could choose to let this define me, or I could choose to be more than this. I chose to be more. I went back to school and got my master's degree. I started a support group for people who'd been victimized by family members. I volunteered with organizations that helped fraud victims. I took my pain and I transformed it into something that could help other people. Tiali and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. She started visiting me regularly. We had dinner together once a month. We talked about things beyond what had happened with Grigian. We talked about her life, her job, her dreams. We talked about my life, my healing, my future. We didn't talk about her brother much, but we talked about him sometimes. We acknowledged what had happened without letting it consume us. Lior also came around. He visited once a month. He brought his family. We had barbecues in my backyard. We played games. We laughed. We were rebuilding something that had been broken, and it was working. Slowly, but surely. Today, I'm 61 years old. Grijan is still in prison. He has served 5 years of his sentence so far, and he won't be eligible for parole for another 2 years at the earliest. I don't know if I'll ever see him again after he gets out. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him completely. But I know that I've survived this. I know that I've built a life that's bigger than his betrayal. I have my job. I have my support group. I have my children who chose to stand by me. I have my friends. I have my house. I have my rebuilt savings account, which is slowly growing again. I have my life, and it's a good life. It's a life that was almost stolen from me, but I reclaimed it. I learned something important through all of this. I learned that trust is precious, but it's not everything. I learned that family is important, but it's not an excuse for betrayal. I learned that betrayal can break you, but it doesn't have to define you. I learned that healing is possible, even when it seems impossible. I learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. And I learned that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the people we love most. That's the hardest lesson of all. But it's the most important one. If you've experienced betrayal by someone you love, know that you're not alone. Know that healing is possible. Know that you can survive this and come out stronger on the other side. Reach out for help. Talk to someone. Don't carry this burden alone.